So that's what we are going to do today. But before I go on, maybe I should ask if there are any questions about the derivation of this formula, because the procedure that we use to get to this formula will be used again and again in the course of the lecture. So are there any questions on these two formulas?
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So say for the modular space of the 4-point function, I want to cut it from integration in y, I want to cut it from 0 to say some epsilon.
Okay.
Does this correspond, epsilon corresponds to some value of q or some value of alpha and gamma?
Some value of alpha. Because
okay.
q always goes to from 0 to 1. So the upper range of q is 1. We'll see how the epsilon comes about. But we have to adjust alpha to match the epsilon, okay, whichever range you want to cover.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so in the next slide, we are going to see the range that we get from here. Okay, are there other questions? Okay, so let me now go ahead. So here is the picture. Okay, so we are studying the singularities near y equal to 1 and near y equal to 0. Okay. So first, we will try to analyze the singularity near y equal to 1. And as you have seen, near y equal to 1, y has an expansion of this kind. Okay, so here I have taken alpha to be large, and I have written the expansion up to this order because we will see that the higher order terms don't really matter if we take large alpha limit. So if we look at this, then we see that the range, because q always ranges from 0 to 1, right? Because the propagator by definition is integral dq over dq q to the L0 minus 1, but q is integrated from 0 to 1. So now we see that the range where q lies between 0 and 1, using this change of variables, translates to the range of y that is given here. And here you see that if you want to cut out some region near 1, okay, say 1 minus epsilon to 1, you have to adjust your alpha so that 1 minus epsilon becomes 1 minus this object. So this is the change of, this is the range in which we will make the change from y to q. In the rest of the range, we will keep y as it is. And you can also easily convince yourself using this change of variable that 1 minus y to the minus 2 dy, that's the singular part of the integral, is in terms of q is given by this, plus order alpha to the minus 2, which will go to 0 as alpha goes to infinity, or in a large alpha limit. So now the idea is that you take this integral from 0 to 1, and then divide this integral into the range that corresponds to q between 0 and 1, that's this range. And outside this range, that's from 0 to this limit, the lower limit of y here, we keep the integral as it is, because this range, in this range, this integral is not singular. So this integral is rewritten in this form. And now the idea is that for this part, you will do the integral as it is, okay? Because this is a finite integral, so you can certainly do this integral. That's the first two terms. For this term, we'll use the replacement rule that integral 0 to 1 dq over q square is actually minus 1, because this is representing really 1 over L0, with L0 equal to minus 1. So that just gives you minus alpha square. And if we now expand this in a large alpha limit, the leading order term, okay, alpha square just cancels. There's a constant piece. That constant piece combines with this minus 1 to give you gamma square minus 1 over 2. Okay, so that's the answer we find from this integral. Now we should just note that in principle, we should also change variable near y equal to 0, because we have to cut out the region near y equal to 0 as well as near y equal to 1. But this part of the integral, because it's perfectly non-singular near y equal to 0, it really makes no difference. So then you change variable from y to q near y equal to 0 or not. Of course, for the other integral dy y to the minus 2, you have to make the corresponding change of variables near q y equal to 0. So is this equation clear? Because this is one of the key points, right? Because we had a divergent integral, and with the help of string field theory, we turned it into a finite integral. Okay, not only finite, but it's completely well defined. Given alpha and gamma, there's an ambiguity in what this integral is. Okay. And here I have taken the limit of large alpha, but you can certainly do this analysis even for finite alpha.
can you just explain how you means why you took this limit, like the lower limit of y to be this? I missed that part.
Lower limit of y to be this?
This 1 minus 1 over alpha squared, this thing, yeah.
Oh, that's from this relation, right? If you look at this relation, then q ranges from 0 to 1, right?
Okay, yeah.
For q equal to 0, y is 1. And for q equal to 1, y is given by this.
Oh, okay.
So this range basically is q between 0 and 1 translates to this range of y.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so that's the range in which we change variable. Outside this range, you don't change variable because it's a particularly non-singular integral. So you can do it as a one integral.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we can do a similar analysis for this. Okay, in fact, by the symmetry of the problem, this should give the same answer, and indeed it does. Okay, because as we discussed, because all the 4 external legs are the same, the S and E channel diagram should give the same result. So that also gives you gamma square minus 1 by 2. And then, of course, you have this integral. You can change variables here 0 and 1 if you want, but it makes no difference because it's a particularly non-singular integral. So this is 1. So now we can add up the results. So gamma square minus 1 by 2 from the previous one, from here. Then gamma square minus y by 2, 1 by 2 from here, and 1. And you see that the result is given by gamma square. This looks like bad news because the result depends on gamma, right? Whereas we have been arguing that the physical amplitudes should be independent of alpha and gamma. So we'll see how to resolve this. But are there any questions up to this point? Is it clear how this comes about? Okay, so let me then proceed. So let's take stock of what is missing. So here we didn't encounter any logarithmic divergence. So that means there is no zero mode in the internal propagator that has to be subtracted. Because if there are zero modes to be subtracted, then we don't expect the amplitude to be independent of alpha and gamma till the very end. Okay, because you have subtracted something, so you have to ultimately do that integral to see this alpha and gamma independence. But here you didn't subtract anything, so you don't expect that to cause a problem. We have also discussed that we have to change variables. So there can be a contribution to the Jacobian in the integration in the form of a Jacobian in the integration measure. But these contributions, okay, any contribution that you get from a Jacobian is really a one loop and higher order effect. That's because Jacobian gives some term of order 1, right? So when you exponentiate, you get a correction to the effective action which is of order 1, whereas the tree level effective action is like 1 over h bar. Okay? So you don't expect the Jacobian factors to affect a tree level result. So the only missing ingredient is possible contribution from the internal psi 1. Because as we have emphasized, remember the psi 1 is extra mode that we have to add because you don't see this in the Siegel gauge. And because it's out of Siegel gauge mode, the psi 1 exchange is not captured by the worldsheet expressions because the worldsheet expressions really arise after you do the gauge fixing in the Siegel gauge. So this contribution has to be included separately. And that's what we are going to do now. Okay, we are going to show how to include the psi 1 exchange contribution to the amplitude. So here is the diagram. Now we have to really evaluate this as a Feynman diagram. There is no shortcut in the form of gluing relation of Riemann surfaces. We really have to evaluate the 3-point vortex, this 3-point vortex, and multiply by the propagator of psi 1. But of course, see, there is only one field, so there is a complication. We can certainly evaluate this 3-point vortex and multiply by the propagator of psi 1. So the psi 1 propagator we have already calculated, it's minus half because the quadratic term in the action is psi 1 square. So what we need to compute are these 3-point vortices. Okay, and that's what I'll describe in the next slide, how to compute these 3-point vortices. So here is a general expression for the 3-point function that we are written out, right? Given 3 axial vortices, V1, V2, V3, the 3-point vortex is given by this. And as we have argued that in principle we have to symmetrize, but because 2 of the external states are the same, and because F1, F2, F3 has been chosen in a cyclic symmetric fashion, we really don't need any symmetrization. Any symmetrization will always give the same result. So this is a dimension 0 primary, C del x. So that just gives you C del x evaluated at F10. This is also a dimension 0 primary, so that gives you C del x evaluated at F30. This, however, is not a dimension 0 primary. It's dimension 0, but it's not a primary. So you have to do some work to figure out what this transformation is. And if you recall in the last lecture, I actually did work out what this object is. Okay, as an example, we started with the transformation law of C and then take the W derivative. And the answer that we had found is given here. It involves del C evaluated at F2 of 0, but there are also double derivatives of F2, which reflects the fact that this is not a primary. But of course, F1, F2, F3 are all known, right? They are all given here. So we can figure out what this object is. Okay, it involves some linear combination of the derivative of C and C, both of which you know, because C correlation function we had written down yesterday. And if you want to take the derivative, C del C, okay, we just have to take the derivative with respect to Z2 of the C correlation function. So this can be used to calculate the 3-point function, which I'll denote by C phi phi psi 1. And then all you need to do is to go back, take the square of the 3-point function, because there are 2 of these, and multiply by the psi 1 propagator, which is minus half. But we'll try to use a shortcut because we don't want to get entangled with the issue of normalization, right? Somebody else may choose a normalization in which it's 2 times this, right? Then what do you do? So, I mean, how we have to then fix the normalization appropriately. So it's a useful trick to always compare the psi 1 exchange contribution to the tachyon exchange contribution, which you already know. So the idea is that now we want to see what happens if instead of psi 1 propagating in the internal state, we have tachyon propagating in the internal state, right? How will it differ from this diagram? So let's consider tachyon exchange contribution instead of psi 1 exchange. So there are 2 differences. First of all, the 3-point function for the tachyon exchange is given by this. Okay, again, these are dimension 0 primary, so their transformation law is simple. C0, okay, this is a tachyon vortex operator. This is also a primary, but a dimension -1 primary. So its transformation law is given here. So that's the first difference. Okay, C phi phi psi 1 differs from C phi phi tachyon. And the second difference is that the psi 1 propagator was -half in the same unit in which the tachyon propagator is -1. Okay, this again you had worked out yesterday by looking at the kinetic operator. So we can write the psi 1 exchange contribution as half. This half comes because that's the ratio of the propagator of psi 1 and the propagator of the tachyon. And then the ratio of the 3-point function of phi phi psi 1 and 3-point function of phi phi t. Take the ratio, square it because there are 2 of these vortices. And then multiply this by the tachyon exchange contribution. Now you see that this ratio is insensitive to the normalization, right? Because both use the same CCC correlation function. So if you multiply the CCC correlation function by some k, it makes no difference here. So what about the tachyon exchange contribution? So tachyon exchange contribution, in fact, you can read out from what we have already computed, because this is just the term containing integral dq q to the -2 in the S and E channel diagrams. So let's go back a few slides and see what that contribution was. So you see, in evaluating this integral, we had this integral dq over q square, whose coefficient was alpha square, and then this is the tachyon exchange. This is due to the tachyon propagator, and we replace this by minus alpha square. So you already know that tachyon exchange contribution is minus alpha square. This is in the S channel, and in the U channel, we also had another minus alpha square. It's the same contribution. Okay, I have not written down the U channel, but it's identical analysis. So you'll get another minus alpha square. That we look at the tachyon exchange contribution in the S and E channel diagram. That's total contribution is -2 alpha square. So we substitute -2 alpha square for the tachyon exchange contribution and just evaluate this. Then you don't have to worry about the normalization of the 3-host correlation function. Now for this computation, it doesn't really matter, but later on it will be useful, okay, to use a trick of this kind. just to make sure that the normalizations are all correct. So by doing that, we get the result for the psi1 extent contribution, and that's basically minus gamma square. So basically what happens is that this ratio becomes gamma square over alpha square. So that multiplied by minus 2 alpha square gives you minus 2 gamma square, and then this half removes the factor of 2, and you get minus gamma square. And now we can add it to the previous result from the worldsheet computation, which was gamma square. And indeed, we see now that the total is 0. So first of all, it's independent of gamma as expected. And it's also consistent with the interpretation that C del X is translational in 0 mode. And hence, there should be no potential for C del X. Are there any questions up to this point?
So the tachyon exchange contribution that you calculated, it depended on alpha. So that means you are computing this since the tachyon is off shell, or the tachyon that flows is off shell. That's why it could be alpha.
That's right. Yeah. It's an internal tachyon, right? Which is an off shell tachyon.
Yeah.
So this is good. Okay, we have gotten the result 0. Now, we note that we could have simplified our analysis a bit if we had worked with gamma equal to 0. If we had chosen gamma to be 0, then the C phi phi square would have vanished automatically, because, well, this is how this requires some computation, but you can show that this 3-point function is identically 0 in that case. And of course, the worldsheet contribution also would have been 0. Just from direct analysis. So then we could get the result without the psi1 exchange diagram. And in this case, there is also an explanation for this fact that there is a Z2 symmetry, which is called the twist symmetry, under which psi1 is odd. But that this Z2 symmetry exists only for a particular class of vortices, for which gamma is 0. And using that Z2 symmetry, we can argue that the phi phi psi1 coupling vanishes. So you could have simplified the analysis in this case by using the Z2 symmetric vortex. But this, of course, cannot be used to eliminate the psi1 extent contribution in loops, okay, because in loops, psi1 will always appear in pairs. So this is one observation which you should just keep in mind.
Ashok, excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
Hello. This is true for any order at 3 level. So any endpoint function you can. And this Z2 symmetry will allow you to essentially neglect this psi1 exchange, or it's only something that happens in this 4-point function?
I suspect that this is probably true for any vortex. I know it's for sure that if we take only the states generated by Virasoro generators and the ghost oscillators, then this is true to any order. Suppose the external state, suppose you are computing the off-shell tachyon potential. Then it is true that we can certainly ignore this psi1, the twist dot states altogether. And I think it's also true for this marginal operator, C del X. But this I'm not completely sure. Maybe Barton can, if Barton is around, maybe he can confirm. But it's certainly true for pure ghosts.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's true in general, but for the tachyons, absolutely. Twist symmetry would do it.
Yeah.
I have a feeling that if, as long as there are no external momenta, there are no vortex operators carrying external momenta, it is probably true in general, because you see the point is you have two symmetries now, right? Because you have this Z2 symmetry and the X goes to minus X symmetry, right? And probably those two together will be able to rule out the psi1 exchange in all internal lines. This is, I'm not completely sure, but it seems likely.
Yeah, so the problem is when you go deep inside the internal propagators in 3 amplitudes, that is not completely obvious what kind of states you are making the product with, and then so it's not completely obvious.
Yeah.
So given external states, I mean, the first propagator will surely not propagate psi1, but then it's not evident at first sight.
Yeah, see, I think it's best to look at it probably from at the level of the action. I agree that if you try to start looking at it from the Feynman diagram viewpoint, it can become complicated. But if one can show at the level of the action that the vortices have this Z2 symmetry, right? And the C is okay. See, as long as C del X is a definite Z2 parity, we are done, right? Because we can use the X goes to minus X to make the Z2 parity 1.
Okay.
Right? So you have to just check, make sure that the C del X has a definite twist parity. Right? Then whether it's minus 1 or plus 1 doesn't matter.
I see, but sometimes it can happen that, I mean, this is somehow special because it never generates a weight 1 field. And therefore it can, I mean, the only, so there are some accidental symmetry that are obeyed by the legs that may not be obeyed by generic weight 1 matter fields.
Yeah, I agree. Once you allow momentum, I don't think it's certainly not going to work.
Yeah.
But if you use only partial X, it may work. I mean, again, I'm not completely sure, but this is something that I think can be checked in principle at the level of the action. For the action has a symmetry of this kind.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. I agree that at zero momentum, you should not have this kind of worries. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. So are there any other questions? Because I'm now moving on to the next example, which is probably more interesting because it has new, I mean, it has at least non-zero results. But maybe I should just pause to see if there are any further questions.
Just a comment maybe on that question. If you took a Witten vertex, for example, that would be a twist invariant, and then there are no higher vertices. But if you take one of those SL2R vertices, then the question would be whether the 4-point function, you can define it also to be twist invariant and consistent with that, because you would have to keep discussing the higher vertices to some level in that case.
I agree. Yeah. I have a feeling that if it's true, we can probably see it without actually constructing the vortices, right? But give some kind of existence proof that it is possible to choose the vortices in a twist invariant way. But again, I'm not completely sure about this.
Okay. Sounds good.
This is something which you are examining, I think. Okay, any other comments, questions?
So we tackle the S channel and U channel separately that we saw, means at least when we use the tachyon thing to cancel this gamma square contribution. So can we identify from which part this contact piece comes, means where you don't have like any singularity, you just have like a 4-point vertex contribution? That is from the one.
Yeah. So the point is, if you look at this integral, this part of the integral is the contact piece.
Oh, okay.
This is the Feynman diagram contribution, right?
Okay.
This part is the contact piece.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's the interpretation.
Okay.
So the part that you do as a y integral and not as a q integral is the contact piece.
Okay.
Okay. So let me go now to the 2-point function of closed strings. Okay. So this I had discussed in the first lecture, but let me remind you what we are after. Okay. So we are in 2-dimensional string theory, where the closed string tachyon is not tachyonic, it's massless field. And our goal is to compute instant on induced amplitude for closed string 2-point function. And we want to do the first subleading order, namely order G string. Because you are considering the instant on induced amplitude, there is already a factor of e to the minus 1 over Gs. So I'll be factoring out this overall factor, okay, because this will be common to all the diagrams. And then we'll introduce some functions, okay, which are defined here. So this is this 2-point function. So these are the two. So boundary condition here is the one relevant for T instant on. So this 2-point function I'll call f omega 1 omega 2, omega 1 and omega 2 are the energies of the two closed string tachyons. And I'll use a convention that the ingoing particles carry negative omega. So the delta momentum, eventual momentum conserving delta function has delta omega 1 plus omega. But if omega 1, omega 2 can be defined for arbitrary omega 1, omega 2 without imposing the delta function constraint, because this amplitude by itself doesn't require that we have omega 1 plus omega 2 is 0. Right? Because as we discussed, the d-incident contribution actually breaks transition invariance. This comes only at the end after integration over the 0 bounds. So this is what I'll call f omega 1, omega 2. This contribution has a product of a disk one-point function and an annulus one-point function. Again, I'll factor out this factor and call the rest g omega 2. There will be a similar contribution where 1 and 2 are exchanged, that I'll call g omega 1. And finally, there is this contribution where we have the product of two disk one-point functions and a diagram in which can be represented as a disk with two holes. In fact, this is somewhat symbolic because we will also include in here another diagram, okay, which is of the same order, and that's a torus with one hole. So let's quickly do the GS counting again. So the way the GS counting goes is that each hole, each disk, each boundary gives 1 over G string, and each closed string vertex operator gives G string. So this is G string squared times 1 over G string, that's ordered G string, as you see here. Here we have 1, 2, 3 boundaries. Sorry, not 1, 2, 3 boundaries. Maybe I should have said it differently. Not that each boundary gives 1 over G string. The disk gives 1 over G string, and after that, every hole you add, you actually get a G string. So the annulus has no power of G string. The disk has a power of 1 over G string. So this gives you 1 over G string, and then 2 factors of G string coming from the 2 vertex operators. So that again is our G string. And here you see 1 over G string times 1 over G string, because 2 disks. 2 factors of G string from the 2 vertices. Okay, that's ordered G string to the 0. And here the disk to begin with had a 1 over G string, but every time you add a hole, you get G string. So that's G string squared divided by G string. So that's again G string. And the corresponding contribution where you have a torus with 1 hole, again torus has G string to the 0, but when you add a hole, you get a factor of G string. So that's also of the same order. Okay. So whenever I draw this diagram, it's understood that this also contains other diagram, which is a torus with 1 hole. So is this notation clear to everybody? So I'm going to now write down the full tachyon 2-point function, okay, full meaning to this order, okay, order GS contribution, instant and inverse contribution to tachyon 2-point function in terms of these functions. And here it is. Okay, so this is the overall factor. And then you see that this is a disk 2-point function. And then you have G of omega 1, that's a product of a disk 1-point function and annulus 1-point function. G of omega 2, that's a product again of a disk 1-point function and annulus 1-point function. And C is just a constant that comes from here. So this doesn't have any omega dependence because omega dependencies are all coming from here, and which is trivial. That just gives a factor of 2 sine hyperbolic pi omega 1 for each 1 punctured disk. So this is the result, but in fact we can do more with these functions, because using the same functions, we can also get expressions for the tachyon n-point function at order G string. And here is the expression, and I'll explain how it comes from. Right? That why only these diagrams are needed for tachyon n-point function. And the reason is that we want to maximize the powers of G string. So every power of external tachyon gives a factor of G string, and every disk gives you 1 over G string. So to this order, to order G string, the way to get a contribution to the n tachyon Green's function or n tachyon amplitude is that we can either have n minus 2 disk 1-point functions and 1 disk 2-point function, or you may have n minus 1 disk 1-point function or 1 annulus 1-point function, or n disk 1-point function, and then a disk with 2 holes or a torus with 1 hole. So basically the non-trivial part of the amplitude that we need are this 2-point function, which is in F, the annulus 1-point function, which is in G, and then this one, this with 2 holes or torus with 1 hole, and that's in C. And this is just all, this is the result of all possible ways of distributing the punctures on these various surfaces. And this extra factor, the external factor, comes by noting that each one puncture disk, namely each of these diagrams, just gives a contribution of 2 sine hyperbolic pi mod omega. Okay, that's the factor of 2 to the n you see, and sine hyperbolic pi mod omega. So are there any questions about this formula? Okay. So let me now proceed. So F, G, and F, C, we have seen have divergences. Okay, the expression for C I have not even written down, but one can write down an expression. It's a complicated object. Okay. These are all divergent, and the divergent parts of F and G are already written down by BRY, which I wrote down in the first day. So F divergent has an expression of this kind. We see that this y integral diverges from y equal to 0. The kind of divergence that we are encountered, and you cannot regulate this divergence or analytically continue this divergence by adjusting external energies, because the exponents are independent of the external energies. But what we can do is to parameterize this as some constant F and then another constant Bf times omega 1 omega 2, because that's the structure we have, right? We have to just make sense of these integrals, but the omega dependence is fixed. Similarly, the expression for G divergence omega, again we wrote down in the first day, and it has an expression of the expansion of this kind. Later on, we'll see in detail the interpretations of these parameters. But it's a divergent integral because it has divergence from V equal to 0, as you can see, and it has divergence from X equal to 0. But nevertheless, we can write this expression as AG plus BG omega square. We have to figure out what these AGs and BGs are by using string field theory, but this is a general structure. So let's now look at the tachyon n-point function at order G string that we wrote down. Okay, so this is a tachyon n-point function. And now let's see how these constants A, BF, AG, and BG, and C affect this n-point function. That's simple because in this sum, you see that there are n times n minus 1 by 2 terms. So AF will appear n times n minus 1 by 2 times, right? So there you get n times n minus 1 by 2 times AF. Similarly, in this sum, G appears n times. So AG will appear n times, that's n times AG. C will always appear once. There is a unique diagram which contains this, where all the external particles are on the disk, okay, and there is a separate disconnected component which has no external particles. So that's C. Now this term, the omega 1 omega 2 or the omega j and omega I square, these actually combine into one term, and that's because of the energy conservation. So because eventually you know that you have energy conservation, and because of this energy conservation, it's easy to see that the sum over I, j less than k, omega j omega k, is in fact nothing but minus half sum over j omega j square, right? Because square of sum of all this is 0. So the only combination that you see in the amplitude is Bg minus Bf over 2, right? That's what we see from here. Okay, Bf over 2 because Bf comes with each of these, but sum over omega j omega k is minus half sum over omega I square. Okay, so that's the way these constants appear in this n-tachyon amplitude. And then of course there are finite pieces which come from the finite parts of F and G. Okay, but those are all known in principle. Are there questions about this formula? Okay, so here I have written down again the same formula. So now the idea is that in principle this is known in the matrix model. In fact, not in principle, the actual amplitude to this order, there is a very explicit expression for the actual amplitude to this order. So in principle, one can now compare this with the matrix model results to get the results for AF, AG, C and this combination. This immediately tells us that each of these are physical observables. That AF, AG, C and 2BG minus TF, BF must be physical observables because they actually enter physical amplitudes, physical end-tachyon amplitudes. So you should be able to determine these unambiguously. And in principle, we can determine these by comparing with the matrix model results. But also, string field theory should give the expressions for these unambiguously. Now, BRY compared this for n equal to 2, okay, numerically, and this is the result. So for n equal to 2, you see that you get the combination AF plus 2AG plus C. Okay, so their result is AF plus 2AG plus C is minus 0.496 and 2BG minus BF is minus 1.399. Okay, again, these are numerical results. And now I'll write down what our results so far give. Okay, so here in this result, lambda is a string field theory parameter. Okay, so it's final, all physical quantities should be independent of lambda. So the result that we have so far is AF is minus half, EF is log lambda square, BG is half log lambda square by 4. AG is work in progress. Okay, hopefully this will be done soon because this is in the last stage. C is not in progress, but there is general argument, okay, which is not so rigorous, okay, which suggests that C is perhaps 0. Okay. So this general argument, maybe I can just say right now what this general argument is based on, and later on I can elaborate on this. Okay. So the general argument basically uses that extra assumption that this formula makes sense for n equal to 0. You see, if you said n equal to 0, right, 0 tachyon amplitude. Formally, this makes sense. Everything goes to 0, right? There is no A for G now. So you get the result C times e to the minus 1 over GS times GS. So what should you compare it with in the matrix model? Now, if we postulate that what it represents in the matrix model is exponential of the instant on action. Okay? Because you see on this side, it's the exponential of the instant on action. Okay? C can be thought of as a correction to the instant on action. Okay? So if we believe that the correspondence goes more than just 8 tachyon amplitude, for 0 tachyon amplitude, okay, this represents the exponential of the instant on action, then one can argue that C should actually vanish. Now, this is not a completely rigorous argument, okay, but we'll see how far we can get. But AG certainly can be determined without any problem. C also in principle can be determined, but the computation is of course much more complicated, and also there is some additional ambiguity that you have to resolve by looking at the tree-level closed string amplitudes. Okay, are there questions?
Does this mean AG is going to be 0 from these?
Well, if C is 0, then AG is 0, right? Okay. But we will calculate AG first, definitely, because AG is almost done. So if AG is 0, then that will get, give some confidence that this argument is probably true, that C is 0. Mm-hmm. If AG is not 0, then C is certainly not 0.
Okay.
Okay, but we will certainly know AG before C. That I am more or less sure. Okay, we'll see how far we have progressed with AG. So we see from here also that BF and BG are not independent of the string field theory parameter, which is okay because we see from here that only this combination enters the entire amplitude. But this combination is independent of the string field theory parameter. 2BG minus BF, okay, if we compute from here, is minus log 4, and that's indeed quite close to this. And this is the result I quoted in the first slide, or in the first step. Okay, so let me now proceed with the computation. So first we will describe the analysis of the divergent part of F, because that's simple. So what is F? This is related to the divergent part of the disk or upper half plane two-part function, because the divergent part of this is given here. Okay, again the overall normalizations are factored out. Okay, they will play no role in our analysis because we already know what the integrand is after factoring out those normalization factors. So the idea is, okay, so let me give the interpretation of this Y. So the way this computation is done, that you actually work in the upper half plane. okay, which is conformally equivalent to a disk. You place the first closed string vertex operator at I, that you can always do. Okay, that fixes two of the conformal killing vectors. And the second one, you cannot fix it fully because that will correspond to fixing 4 parameters, but you can take the real part of that to be 0. Okay, you can fix the second one on the imaginary axis. So you label it by IY. So you take the first one at I, second one at IY, and that is the interpretation of the Y that appears here. And as you can see that Y goes to 0 divergence here is the divergence that you get when this vertex operator, the closed string tachyon vertex operator, approaches the real axis. So this is the divergent integral, and as we have been emphasizing, in order to determine what this is, you have to first find a relation between Y and Q, okay, where Q is an appropriate string field theory parameter, or Q, not string field theory parameter, Q is an appropriate Schwinger parameter in some string field theory. Okay. So you have to find a relationship between Y and Q. And for that, again, you have to represent this amplitude as Feynman diagram, sum over Feynman diagrams. And you represent this as a sum of 2 Feynman diagrams. Okay, in fact, these are the only 2 which are relevant, because internal closed strings will not include, because those you will assume that they have been integrated out because the problem doesn't exist. At least for internal closed strings, you can use analytic contribution. So you'll not worry about those. Yeah. Okay, so you are only interested in divergences that come from internal open strings. And you can easily convince yourself that that CC amplitude basically comes from 2 diagrams, which is A and B. Okay, this is the contact interaction. This is where you have an internal open string propagator. So our convention will be the thick lines will denote closed strings and thin lines will denote open strings. Now it's clear from this that if you want to compute this diagram, and that's where the singularity is going to come from, we need the off-shell 2-point vertex of an open string and a closed string. Closed strings are of course always on-shell, but we need off-shell vertex for the open string, and that basically means that you have to make a choice of local coordinates at the open string function. Okay, so this is what we'll do now. Okay, so the final result will of course depend on the choice of local coordinates at the open string function. Okay, at least the final result for this amplitude. Are there any questions? Okay. So now let me specify the CO interaction vertex. So the way we will specify the interaction vertex is that we will put C at I, O at 0. You can always do that because CO interaction vertex is on the upper half plane. You have 3 conformal killing vectors. Now you have an external C and an external O. So you can always use these 3 conformal killing vectors to place C and O anywhere you like. So you place C at I, O at 0. And you make the simplest possible choice of local coordinate that we can think of, which is W equal to lambda times Z. Okay, so this is the local coordinate associated with the open string. Okay. Lambda is an arbitrary parameter that you have chosen, arbitrary constant. We'll take it to be large. This will play the role of alpha, for example, in the as we saw in the previous analysis. And Z is the coordinate on the upper half plane. So with this choice, we are in business to calculate this amplitude. So you have to find a Swing relation. So the Swing relation is the same. We take 2 copies of the upper half plane because there are 2 vertices, 2 interaction vertices. So you take 2 copies of the upper half plane and identify the local coordinate for this open string and the local coordinate for this open string by this standard Swing relation W prime equal to minus Q. And because W is lambda times Z, we can now translate this into an identification in the Z and Z prime planes. So that gives you lambda square Z prime equal to minus Q. So at this stage, you can either use the Z prime or Z to describe our final upper half plane. Okay, I'll use Z coordinate. So in the Z coordinate, let's see where the punctures are located. Original punctures, for this vertex, suppose this is the Z coordinate. So this closed string puncture is of course at I. Okay, so we have not changed anything, Z equal to I. The other closed string puncture is at Z prime equal to I. But this translates to Z using this relation as IQ by lambda square. But from the previous convention, we have declared that the punctures are at I and IY. Okay, this is the meaning of the variable y. So you see that we have to declare that this is IY, and that gives a relationship between y and q, namely y is simply q over lambda square. Is this clear? Okay. So you have got y equal to q over lambda square. So the q range from 0 to 1 now maps back to y from 0 to 1 over lambda square, as you can see. So we now analyze f divergent using this. So we take this integral and divide it into two parts. One part from 0 to 1 over lambda square, that will be covered by q. The other one from 1 over lambda square to 1. This part will regard as a contribution from the contact term, contribution from this vertex over here. And for this part of the integral, we are going to change variable from y to q. Okay, so here it is. Okay, we change variable from y to q. Okay, this part I left as it is. Okay, and now we are going to use the replacement rule. So what is the replacement rule? We have dq q to the minus 2. So that's supposed to be replaced by minus 1. Okay? This is the tachyon propagator, 1 over minus 1. So that gives you minus half lambda square. Then you have dq q inverse. We are simply supposed to drop it, because that's an internal zero mode. Okay? And as we discussed, that all the internal zero modes have to be dropped. Okay? In this case, in fact, you can easily check that this internal zero mode is just the collective mode. Okay? So you are dropping it. So you just get minus half lambda square. And this part of the integral, okay, we can easily do. This gives you 1 over lambda square minus 1, multiplied by a factor of half. So that, sorry, this gives you not 1 over, this gives you lambda square by 2 minus 1, minus half. Okay. So combining this with the minus half lambda square, you get minus half. And the second part, that gives you log lambda, okay, 2 omega 1 omega 2 log. And again, let me remind you that minus omega 1 and omega 2 are the energies of the incoming and outgoing series. Okay. And this we can take as a result for arbitrary omega 1 omega 2. You don't need to impose omega 1 plus omega 2 equal to 0, because we are still working on the T instructor. And in fact, for endpoint amplitude, you will not impose omega 1 plus omega 2 equal to 0, right? Because the final delta function contains all the omegas. Okay, so now here is an important point. For the choice of local coordinates you have made, one can check easily that the C psi 1 vertex vanishes. This calculation I will not do, but it's very easy to check. All you have to do is that you take this local coordinate and take the C and psi 1. So what do you have to do? Psi 1 vertex operator is del C, partial C. In this case, the local coordinate is just proportionality, so that you get partial C at z equal to 0. And you have to just check that partial C at z equal to 0, the correlation function of that with C bar at I, okay, is 0. Right? Because C is always put at I, right? So that vertex operator is C bar times closed string tachyon vertex operator I. But just in the ghost sector, this amplitude vanishes. So if this line had been psi 1, okay, the 2-point function would have vanished, and hence there is no psi 1 exchange contribution. Okay. So this is closest to what we can get to the simpler kind of vortex that we saw, right? The twist invariant vortex. Okay. So this is playing the role of twist invariant vortex. By choosing W equal to lambda z, this kind of local coordinate system, we have made sure that the psi 1 exchange is not there. This will simplify our life, but we cannot avoid psi 1 altogether, as we'll see. Okay, so no need to include psi 1 exchange contribution. Okay. So then the final result is given here. Okay, that's what we found in the last slide here. And these you now identify as AF plus BF omega 1 omega 2. And so here are the promised answers. AF is minus half, BF is log lambda square. As we have emphasized, minus half is observable. Okay, by comparing with appropriate n tachyon amplitudes, you can actually figure out what AF is. from the matrix model side. Okay, and one should be able to compare this minus half with the matrix model answer. BF is not an observable. Right? You have to combine this with AG to get an observable. Now we can ask what would have happened if you had used a different local coordinates for the CO vortex. Now, of course, the result would be different. What result would be different? The result for this amplitude would be different, okay, if you had used a different local coordinate. But from what we have learned, we know that for at least the contribution to AF will have to be compensated by psi1 exchange. So I'll leave this as an exercise. You choose your own vortex. Okay, you choose your own preferred local coordinate system. Instead of lambda z, you choose something else. Carry out this analysis that we have done here. Compute F divergence. And then also compute the psi1 exchange contribution. And so that the AF that you get is independent of the choice of local coordinates. Now this is no longer true for BF because BF itself is not an observable. So for BF, there may be a dependence on local coordinates. If you choose a different local coordinate, you may get a different BF. But finally, this combination BF minus 2BG, of course, is observable. So it has to cancel against the contribution to 2BG. Okay. Again, this is an exercise. We will describe the computation of 2BG at least in some detail, and then we will see how we can do this. Are there questions?
So you said that this psi1 contribution cannot be done away with completely. So in the calculation of AG and BG, it will come. Is that
Yes, exactly. We'll see that in the even with this simple vortex, in the calculation of AG and BG, it will come. Okay. So now let me turn to the divergent part of G. This one is much more complicated, and I'll only begin today. Okay, I'll do the simpler part maybe. I think I'll have maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So I'll do the simpler part of the analysis today, leaving the more difficult part for next time. So first, let me give the interpretation, okay, of these parameters, because that's important, because ultimately you want to relate V and X to some Q1 and Q2, right? The Qs of two propagators. So for this, it's important to know what V and X are geometrically. So the interpretation of V is given here. So the annulus we define, say in the W plane. Maybe W is an unfortunate notation because W you have been using for local coordinates. Okay, but just locally think of W just as a coordinate on the annulus. So you identify W with W plus I log V inverse. So there is a periodic identification. Okay. So you identify this line over here with this line over here. Okay. So that we have a cylinder that's topologically the same as an annulus. And this width, okay, we normalize so that this width is pi. Okay. So real W runs between 0 and pi. There's no identification on this side. Okay. The identification is between the upper and lower end. So that's the interpretation of V. Okay. Log V basically controls this length. Okay. Once we have normalized this as pi. 2 pi x measures the distance of the closed string vortex operator. Remember, this is a one-point function on the annulus. So 2 pi x is the distance of the closed string vortex operator from the boundary. Okay. So from the W equal to 0 n, it's 2 pi x. Its position in the vertical direction doesn't matter because there is translation impedance in the vertical direction. Right? Because these two lines are periodically identified. Right? On the cylinder, you can translate along the circumference and nothing changes. Okay. So on this, the position along this doesn't matter, but the position away from the boundary matters. So this is the distance from the boundary. So now the idea is that we'll look at various Feynman diagrams and try to identify the relation between X and V with Q1 and Q2 in these various Feynman diagrams. Are there questions? Okay, so here are the Feynman diagrams that we need to evaluate. So let me explain these various Feynman diagrams. Okay, so I think that this vortex, this is the closed open vortex. This is an open vortex. Okay. This is an annulus diagram because this is a one loop open string diagram. So that's annulus. This is closed open vortex, and this one is basically the one-point function of the open string on the annulus. That's a vortex. So this is a non-singular part of the one-point function of the open string on the annulus. We'll later see what it means. So this is a diagram that you have to include. Then you have closed open vortex. So, and then if you take the two open strings that come out of the closed open vortex and join them together, okay, then that's also a one-point function on the annulus. That's a contribution to one-point function on the annulus. And finally, this is the contact term. This should be completely non-singular, okay, away from all singularities. Each of these will have some singularities, because you see that whenever you see the propagator, right, the corresponding q going to 0 is a singular limit, right? Either v goes to 0 or x goes to 0. So similarly, here there is a propagator, here there is a propagator. So these are singular diagrams. This one is non-singular. So this cross will denote one-point vortex on the annulus, okay, as I have said. So you see here that we need several new vortices, right? We cannot just go ahead and start calculating this, because we have not said anything about OOO interaction vortex that we need here. We have not said anything about COO interaction vortex, right? What is this vortex? We need this. And also we need this vortex, O interaction vortex on the annulus. So only after you have constructed all these that you can start calculating these Feynman diagrams. So these by definition covers everything that is not covered by these diagrams. But by construction, this is away from the singularities. So this integral will basically do as the integral over v and x without changing any variables. But what's important here is to know which range of v and x you should integrate over. Okay? That's the analog of this integral, for example. This part, okay, is perfectly non-singular, but you need the information about the range, right? And that came from this. Okay? The fact that q between 0 and 1 maps to y between 0 and 1 plus 0 and 1 over lambda square means that the rest of the range is a contract interaction. So this is what we have to do. Are there questions? Okay, so let me say a few words about construction of these vortices, and then I'll stop. So for O, yes.
Don't we have more diagrams? One, for example, that has it goes to a solid line to a small, a thin line, and then to a solid line, and then ends on a disk.
Okay, yes. So the point is that we are ignoring any diagram where the internal line is a closed string, because those we are assuming you have integrated out. Because the divergences that you are after are the open string divergences, right?
Okay, yes. Thank you.
You are assuming that all the internal closed strings are already integrated out, right? So you are thinking in terms of effective action where the closed strings are integrated out. That's why you have drawn only the internal open strings. But you are right. For example, if you are trying to compute the singularities associated with cuts, the imaginary part, then you need those diagrams.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions? Okay, so for the OO vortex, we are going to use this. Yeah, and this in fact is the gamma equal to 0 version of the vortex that we described earlier. Okay. So you see that we now have one new parameter. Besides lambda, we also have alpha that is entered. Now for the COO vortex, okay, we have to do a little more work. Okay. So first, let me describe the general structure of the COO amplitude. Okay. So COO, right? We have altogether two positions of the C vortex, one position of the O and one position of the O. So we have four parameters, okay? Four parameters on the upper half plane that you have to specify. And the three conformal Killing vectors can be used to fix three of them. Okay? And we will use a convention where we use the three conformal Killing vectors to fix the C at I. Okay? That's what we had done earlier also. And we will place the pair of O's at a symmetric point, plus minus beta. So beta cannot be fixed by the conformal Killing vector. So beta we have to integrate over. So what we need to do is to specify the local coordinates at the O's. Okay, local coordinates at the C doesn't matter. And you have to also fix the range of beta associated with the COO vortex. But how do you fix the range of beta? To fix the range of beta, we have to first analyze the COO amplitude. Okay, so you have to go back and analyze the COO amplitude. So the idea is that we will first have to determine the range of beta that is covered by Feynman diagrams with known vortices. And then the COO vortex, elementary COO contact vortex, will cover the missing range. And I'll explain this in the next slide how it's done. Okay, but this is the way you have to construct the COO vortex.
So in this diagram, it looks like if we take beta to 0, means when beta tends to 0 rather,
Yes.
we get one of the diagrams which is like a 1 point open string on the annulus mediated by a open string propagator, right?
Yes, we will see that diagram. We'll see what that corresponds to. Okay, in the next slide. If we just wait for the next slide, we'll see this. So here is the COO amplitude. Okay. So in the convention that you're using, where the internal lines are on the open string, this has two Feynman diagrams. Okay. So one is this, and the one is a contact interaction. So now here, this of course you can compute because CO vortex you already know, and the OO vortex you have already introduced. So you can evaluate this diagram and figure out which region in the beta space is covered by this diagram. And indeed, the Q goes to 0 limit corresponds to beta goes to 0 in this diagram. So using this amplitude, right, we can determine the range of beta that is covered by this diagram. And in fact, also we can figure out what are the local coordinates at the O's that are induced from the OO vortex, right? Because OO vortex had some local coordinates already on the O's, and that's the local coordinate that we'll get for this diagram. So I'll just give the answer. Again, you can easily work it out. So the local locations of the open string punctures, the location C will place at I. The locations of the open string punctures will be at minus Q over 2 lambda tilde plus Q over 2 lambda tilde. So indeed, as Q goes to 0, the two punctures come together. So this you can identify as your beta. Lambda tilde is lambda times alpha. It's not a new parameter. It's just a combination of the old ones. Q, as usual, is ranges between 0 and 1. And the induced local coordinates at these two punctures, which I can call W1 and W2, are given here. Okay, this again you can easily work out. Okay, because you know the local coordinates in the Z prime coordinate. If Z prime is a vortex for this, and you know the relation between Z and Z prime by the Swing relation. So you just have to convert the local coordinates in terms of Z, right? Because in Z plane, the closed string puncture is located at I. So this diagram then covers the range where mod beta is less than 2 lambda tilde inverse, right? Because you see that when Q is 1, right, the punctures are located at minus 1 over 2 lambda tilde and plus 1 over 2 lambda tilde. So this range is covered by this diagram. So this vortex will have to cover the other range, mod beta larger than 2 lambda tilde inverse. And whatever local coordinates you choose for the O's, okay, for this, it has to match the ones that are given here, okay, these local coordinates at the boundary between the two regions, right? At beta equal to 2 lambda tilde, you are approaching Q, that corresponds to Q goes to 1 from this side, and that corresponds to beta goes to 1 over 2 lambda tilde from this side. So local coordinates better match. Is this procedure clear? So with this, let me give the choice of the COO vortex that we have made. So beta we take to range from 1 over 2 lambda tilde to 1. Beta larger than 1 is actually related to beta less than 1 by Z goes to minus 1 over Z transformation. Okay, so we don't include that separately. So beta we take in this range. And local coordinates at a pair of O's, we now take it in this form. Okay, it looks fairly complicated. Okay, but that's what we choose. Okay. We see that there is a new parameter which has entered, in fact, a new function which has entered, this F. Okay. ZAs are beta and minus, so Z1 is minus beta, Z2 is beta. Okay, so the A here is 1 and 2. Okay, so I have described both local coordinates at one go. This F is a function, F of beta, which we keep arbitrary. It has this property. Okay, this is a convenience. If beta goes to minus beta, okay, that's the symmetry of this diagram. You can see from here, right? Beta and minus beta, you can impose the beta goes to minus beta symmetry. So that puts f of minus beta equal to minus f of beta. And this is the boundary condition. This is needed to make sure that this choice of local coordinate that we have here matches the choice of local coordinate that we have here at q equal to 1. Okay, at q equal to 1, z1 becomes 1 over 2 lambda tilde. And you can easily check that this w1 matches the w1 that we'll get from this here once you set f equal to half. So that's one boundary condition on f. And this boundary condition follows from the requirement that the choice of local coordinates, you want it to be invariant under z goes to minus 1 over z. That forces f of 1 to be 0. So here, this is what I've said. This is needed for smooth matching with the Feynman diagrams that are induced from CO and OO joining. So what we see here that we have now introduced a new parameter, but this is in fact a whole function, okay, which labels string field theory data. This is the function of beta. Okay. And again, if we do things right, then the final answer should be independent of f of beta. Okay, even though intermediate answers could depend on f of beta. Are there questions? Okay, so with this, I should have said one more thing I should say. The O interaction vortex on the annulus, this can be done by following the same principle. Okay. So here I have just given the answer. Okay. What one can show is that this 1 point function of O on the annulus corresponds to a vortex which covers this region, V larger than alpha square minus half inverse. Okay. So you see that this avoids the V goes to 0 limit, so this is not singular, there is the contact interaction. Okay. And the corresponding choice of local coordinates that matches smoothly the boundaries is this one. Again, of course, this is not unique. I have just chosen it this way. But you couldn't make it very much simpler. Okay? Because we have to make sure that when V is equal to alpha square minus half inverse, okay, that's the place where it matches the Feynman diagram. Okay? And that the other local coordinates should match. Okay, so it's perhaps not very important, these formulae, okay, but the principle should be clear, okay, that to determine a particular interaction vortex, we have to make sure that we first compute the amplitude to which the interaction vortex first contributes. Okay. You draw all the Feynman diagrams, and whatever is missing from the Feynman diagrams, you incorporate in the interaction vortex, the contact interaction. And then that contact interaction you can use to compute other Feynman diagrams with larger number of legs or larger number of loops. Okay, so with this, now I'll give the result for the worldsheet contribution to G divergence. So here are these 4 diagrams, okay, A, B, C, D. We have given all the vortices now, okay, so you can compute this. Okay. Change variable from YV to Q1, Q2, okay, by using the swing relations. Okay. You do the same thing here, do the same thing here, and same thing here. And here are the results that we get. We see that each diagram gives pretty complicated results. This is the contact interaction. This gives complicated results just because the boundary of this region is complicated in the Vx space. And you see that there are all kinds of dependencies on the parameters alpha, lambda, tilde, as well as a function f over here. And here what I have described is the sum of these. So this gives the divergent part of G. Okay, that's the worldsheet contribution. But that's only the easy part of it. Okay, so what we will do next time is to describe the other parts that you have to compute. Okay, so let me just remind you what the other parts are. First, you have to look at the psi1 exchange contribution, okay, because you see here in any of these propagators you could have put a psi1. Right? That contribution has to be computed separately. Fortunately, things will simplify a bit because psi1 here will give you 0 because of the fact that the 2-point function of closed string and the tachyon and psi1 is 0. So psi1 here will give you 0, psi1 here will give you 0. But you can put a psi1 here and you can put a psi1 here. So those diagrams you have to evaluate. So that's the first extra contribution. then you have to take into account the effect of the measures. So you have to first work out the correct change of variable from the open string 0 mode to the collective modes. Okay. Find the Jacobian and find its contribution to the 1-point function. And we have to do the same thing for the forces. And at the end of it, we get the full G of omega. So next time I'll describe some of these calculations, and I'll also say where we are at this stage. Okay, so I think today I'll stop here. Are there questions?
Can I ask a question about 1-point annulus interaction vertex? So
This one?
yeah. So maybe like if you look at the Witten type open string field theory, there is only a cubic vertex. Do we need to include that vertex also in that case?
The cubic vertex. Yes.
Right.
Okay. So of course that's true. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So let me go back to this diagram. Or maybe I can explain here. You see, okay. So the way we get the 1-point vertex is that you just cut out. Let's imagine that these things are not there. The closed string part is not there, right? So open string 1-point function on the annulus will get contribution from the first diagram and the second diagram.
Yes.
Okay. So the first diagram we can figure out how much range it covers.
Yes.
And then we cover the rest of the range by this one.
Yes.
And we make sure that the local coordinate choice here matches the local coordinate choice here at the boundary. That's how
Yes.
I got the vertex that we have here.
Yes.
So if we do use a 3-point vertex.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In Witten's vertex, things are somewhat singular because this will cover all the way to the other degeneration. V goes to infinity limit. Right?
Oh,
That's why it's useful to work with these vertices with large alpha and lambda, where you know that these cover only a small region near the boundary, and the rest of the regions are all in the contact term. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you see here that the range that of V that the contact term has goes almost all the way to V equal to 0, right? For large alpha, you start at a small value of V. So the Feynman diagram covers only a very small region near V equal to 0. Whereas in Witten's analysis, right, this V, this part will be infinite. Okay, because everything is covered by the Witten vertex.
Okay, I see. Mm-hmm.
So for these kind of calculations, I think it's much easier to work with the vertices with stubs, which basically transfers large alpha and lambda.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Yes.
It's just a general question. When you use the condition f of 1 equals 0,
Yes.
so I just wanted to ask, such conditions are also in topology, in homotopy. So can this work be connected to topology or any link you know of?
Well, so here, of course, topology is very trivial, right? We have just a real line. Okay? I mean, f of 1 equal to 0 just comes from the fact that we want this local coordinate system, okay, to be invariant under z goes to -1 over z, because that's like a modular transformation, because it just maps the beta larger than 1 region to beta less than 1 region. Okay? And so at 1, you have to make sure that it matches up correctly, and that's what gives this f of 1 equal to 0 condition.
Right, thank you.
Ashok, I had the question, do you ever use the BV formalism, or do you just use that psi1 state? Is that the only?
Yeah, so once you have determined that you need the psi1, after that you don't need the BV.
Yeah, okay.
Well, we need not the BV, but we'll have to figure out, for example, the change of measure from the ghost in the ghost sector, right? Because you have to figure out the relationship between the ghosts, the gauge transformation parameter that comes from the open string theory, and the gauge transformation parameter that the rigid U want. We know that they are related, but they could be related by field definition. So you have to find that field definition. So you don't need BV as such, but you need to find that field definition.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So when you construct this analysis with one open string vertex, so in
Yes.
principle, there's another diagram where the hole shrinks so that you go to the closed string channel. But is the idea that you can just choose the coordinates around the closed strings for the lower dimensional vertices such that it always matches the analysis with one open string vertex that you constructed?
Yeah, so this is related to the other question that was asked, that we are ignoring here all the closed string degenerations, right? Because
Right.
closed string degenerations we know we can figure out, okay, by analytic continuation.
Right.
Okay, so indeed there is a contribution. So those in my language, right, are all in the finite parts of F and G.
Right, I see, I see. Okay, thanks.
Okay, are there any more questions? Okay, so thanks again, Ashok. And again, if people want to stay online after we stop recording, feel free to do that. So see you tomorrow.
Thanks.
So the link for the PDF file doesn't seem to be working for me. Is that just me?